By the time the first snowflake touched the ground, Everett Shaw had already carried 12 bundles of wool into the mountain cave, stacked 3 weeks of firewood against the rear wall, and dug a narrow drainage channel beneath the entrance. The men in town thought he had lost his mind. Everett knew better. He had seen the winter coming. What none of them knew was that he wasn't preparing the cave for himself. He was preparing it for a 68-year-old woman who had nowhere else to survive the cold. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy emotional Wild West stories about survival, second chances, and unexpected kindness, subscribe and stay with us, because Everett is about to risk everything to keep one forgotten woman alive through the harshest winter the valley has seen in years. Everett was 34 and had spent most of his life working the high country above Blackwater Creek. He knew the mountains well enough to recognize changes other people dismissed. By late September, the animals had already begun moving toward lower ground. The squirrels were burying twice as many nuts. Elk had disappeared from the northern slopes earlier than usual. Even the old cottonwood trees along the creek had shed their leaves before October arrived. Everett noticed all of it. He remembered the winter of 1887, when snow had trapped 3 families for nearly a month. He remembered the sound of cattle crying in the darkness, and the way men burned through their firewood twice as fast as expected. This year felt worse. His concern became personal when he found the old woman beside the abandoned stage road. Her name was Agnes Whitmore. She was 68, thin beneath a faded blue wool coat, and sitting beside a broken wagon with one hand wrapped around a walking stick. Everett had been riding home when he spotted her. "Ma'am, where are you headed?" Agnes looked toward the mountains. "Nowhere anymore." He climbed down from his horse. "Where's your family?" She shook her head. "Gone." "Do you have a place to stay?" "I had one." Her voice was quiet. "The roof collapsed last night." Everett looked at the wagon. A small sack of flour, 2 blankets, and a wooden box were all she had left. "Town is 12 miles east." Agnes gave a tired laugh. "I won't make 12 miles." Everett studied her face. She wasn't asking him for pity. That made the answer easier. "Come with me." Agnes hesitated. "I don't want charity." "Good." He reached for the reins. "Neither do I." She frowned. "Then what are you offering?" Everett looked toward the dark ridge above them. "A place to stay until spring." He took her to his ranch, but the cabin had one serious problem. It was too exposed to the northern wind. The walls were solid, yet the roof leaked around the chimney, and the stove consumed wood faster than Everett could replace it. He had already decided he wouldn't risk an elderly woman there during a severe winter. That evening, he showed Agnes the cave. She stood at the entrance, staring into the darkness. "You expect me to sleep in there?" "Not yet." Everett stepped inside and placed his lantern on the stone floor. "First, I'm going to make it warmer than my cabin." Agnes looked at him as though he had said something impossible. Everett pointed toward the back wall. "The mountain will hold the cold outside. Wool will stop the drafts. Firewood will keep the heat going." Agnes shook her head. "Young man, I'm too old to be hiding in caves." Everett looked at her calmly. "Maybe, but you're not too old to survive one winter." Outside, the wind moved through the trees. A few more snowflakes began falling against the cave entrance. Everett looked at the mountain, then at Agnes. He had less than 6 weeks to prepare, and by the time winter arrived, he would discover whether a cave, wool, and enough firewood could truly save a life. By the second week of October, Everett Shaw had turned the cave into a place that barely resembled the dark hollow Agnes had first seen. He had carried in enough dry pine and juniper to fill one entire side of the rear chamber, stacking the pieces on raised wooden rails so melting snow could not reach them. Along the walls he hung thick panels of raw wool beneath heavy canvas. The wool smelled earthy and strong, but when Everett stood near the entrance, he could barely feel the mountain wind. Agnes watched him work from a flat stone near the fire. "You really believe this will keep me warm?" she asked. Everett tightened a rope around the wooden frame. "I don't believe it. I'm testing it." "What's the difference?" "Belief doesn't tell you where something fails." Agnes smiled faintly. "You've been alone too long." Everett glanced at her. Maybe. He had already discovered the first weakness. The cave stayed warmer than the outside air, but moisture gathered near the entrance whenever Agnes brought snow inside on her boots. Everett cut a shallow channel through the floor and directed the water toward the mouth. Then he raised the sleeping platform nearly a foot above the stone. Agnes watched as he placed 2 layers of wool beneath the mattress. "That's too much," she protested. "The floor is cold. Stone doesn't forgive mistakes." He looked toward the entrance. Neither does winter. Agnes had spent most of her life depending on other people to make decisions for her. Her husband had chosen where they lived, what they bought, and when they moved. After he died, her son had insisted she sell the little farm and move closer to town. She refused. When the roof collapsed, and suddenly the independence she had fought to keep had become dangerous, Everett never asked her why she was alone. That restraint made her trust him more than questions would have. One afternoon, while Everett was repairing the entrance, Agnes noticed him studying a thermometer. "How cold is it?" she asked. "Outside? 31. And inside? 46. Agnes stared at him. "Without the fire?" "Without the fire." He pointed toward the stone walls. "The mountain doesn't change temperature as quickly as the air." Agnes looked around the cave again. For the first time, she stopped seeing a hole in the hillside. She saw a possibility. Everett still wasn't satisfied. The next morning, he lit the small iron stove and watched the smoke. It drew poorly at first. He immediately extinguished the fire. "What's wrong?" Agnes asked. "Too much smoke." He climbed outside, cleared the pipe, and returned with a bundle of clay. He sealed the gaps around the stove opening and added a simple metal cap above the chimney. Then he tested it again. This time, the smoke disappeared cleanly. "You could have waited until tomorrow," Agnes said. "Winter won't wait until tomorrow." By the end of the week, word had reached the nearby trading post that Everett was preparing a cave for an old woman. Men laughed over their coffee. One called it a grave with a chimney. Another said Agnes would freeze before Christmas. Everett heard the comments when he rode into town for supplies. He didn't argue. He bought another load of wool, 2 sacks of dried beans, lamp oil, and enough firewood to last several additional weeks. When he returned, Agnes was standing outside the cave watching the first serious snow settle on the ridge. "They think you're foolish," she said. Everett unloaded the supplies. "They thought the same thing when I built my ranch here." Agnes looked toward the white peaks. "And if they're right this time?" Everett paused. "Then we'll find out before the real winter arrives." That night, the temperature fell below 20 degrees for the first time. Everett checked the thermometer before bed. The cave remained above 40. Agnes sat beneath a wool blanket beside the stove, listening to the wind outside. She looked at Everett. "Maybe you can save me from the cold." He shook his head. "No." She frowned. "Then what are you doing?" Everett looked around the cave. "I'm building a place where the cold doesn't get the final say." Neither of them knew that the first real storm was already forming beyond the northern mountains. By the 3rd week of October, Agnes had stopped calling the cave a hiding place. She called it the winter room. Everett pretended not to notice the change, but it mattered to him. Every morning, he checked the wool panels, tested the stove draft, and counted the firewood stacked against the rear wall. He had learned that preparation was not about making something perfect. It was about discovering what could fail before the weather discovered it for you. The first serious test came after a night of freezing rain. When Everett opened the outer curtain, water had frozen along the bottom edge of the wool. Agnes touched it carefully. "That doesn't look good." "It isn't." He removed the curtain and carried it outside. "If this freezes during a storm, we won't be able to open the entrance." He raised the lower edge several inches, added a wooden threshold, and placed a narrow drainage groove beneath it. Then he hung the curtain again, leaving a small gap between the wool and the stone. "Better?" Agnes asked. Everett pulled the curtain aside. "We'll know tomorrow." The following morning, it remained dry. Agnes smiled. "You were right." "No." Everett looked at the entrance. "We found the problem." That answer stayed with her. Most people Agnes had known treated mistakes as proof that someone was incompetent. Everett treated them as information. It was one of the reasons she had begun trusting him. Another was the way he never spoke to her like she was helpless. He asked her to help sort the wool. He let her choose where to place her few belongings. He even asked which side of the sleeping platform she preferred. It had been years since anyone had asked Agnes what she wanted. One afternoon, she found Everett staring at an old blanket she had brought from the collapsed house. "That's all I saved," she said. "It belonged to my mother." Everett nodded. "Then keep it dry." He built a wooden chest for it and placed the chest above the floor. Agnes looked at him. "You remember everything, don't you? Things that matter." She turned away before he could see how much the answer affected her. That evening, Everett performed another test. He let the fire burn for 2 hours, then closed the stove damper and watched the thermometer. The cave reached 58 degrees. 3 hours later, it had fallen only to 49. Outside, the temperature was already 22. Agnes sat beneath her mother's blanket and watched the numbers. "You really think this can get us through winter? If we keep the wood dry." "That's a big if." Everett looked toward the stacked firewood. "Then we'll make sure it isn't." The next morning, he discovered another problem. Snow had blown through a gap near the entrance and dampened several pieces of wood. He moved the entire stack farther inside and built a second raised rack. Agnes helped carry the smaller pieces. "You don't have to do that," Everett said. "Neither do you." He smiled. "Fair enough." By early November, the cave had become their daily routine. Agnes cooked simple meals. Everett maintained the shelter. They ate together beside the stove, and gradually their conversations moved beyond weather and supplies. She told him about the farm she had lost. He told her about the older brother who had taught him to hunt before disappearing during a winter expedition. Neither spoke about loneliness directly. They didn't need to. Then one morning, Everett stepped outside and stopped. The mountains were covered in a strange yellow-gray haze. There was no wind, no birds. Even the horses stood unusually still. Agnes came to the entrance. "What is it?" Everett stared north. "The winter we were preparing for." By sunset, the first flakes began falling, and before morning, the road to town would disappear completely. The real winter arrived before sunrise. Snow had covered the trail, buried the fence posts, and turned the trees along Blackwater Creek into white shapes barely visible through the storm. Everett stood at the cave entrance watching the wind push snow across the mountain. "How long?" Agnes asked from behind him. He looked at the sky. "At least 3 days. And the road? Gone already." She was quiet. Everett turned toward her. "That's why we prepared." By noon, the storm had become violent. Snow pressed against the outer curtain, but the offset entrance prevented the wind from reaching the living chamber. Everett checked the stove every hour. The firewood remained dry, the water basin stayed liquid, and the sleeping platform remained warm beneath the layers of wool. Agnes sat near the stove reading an old book while Everett recorded the temperature. Outside, the thermometer dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, it remained 47. "You're smiling," Agnes said. Everett looked up. "Am I?" "A little. Maybe because the cave is working." Agnes closed the book. "Or maybe because you're relieved." He considered that. Both. For 2 days the shelter held. Then the temperature fell sharply. Snow climbed higher around the entrance, and the wind began pushing powder beneath the outer curtain. Everett woke before dawn and immediately noticed something wrong. The stove flame was weak. He crouched beside it and checked the draft. "What's happening?" Agnes asked. "The chimney." He grabbed his coat. "Where are you going?" "Outside. In this. I have to clear the pipe." Agnes stood. "Don't go." Everett looked at her. "If the stove stops drawing, smoke comes inside. Then I'll come with you." "No." He handed her the safety rope. "Stay here. Hold this." He tied the other end around his waist and stepped through the entrance. The wind struck him so hard he nearly lost his footing. Snow covered his boots within seconds. He crawled toward the chimney, using the rope to find his way back. Ice had formed around the pipe cap. Everett knocked it loose with the handle of his shovel. Snow immediately began collecting again. He cleared it twice before the draft returned. Then he felt the rope tighten. Agnes was pulling. Everett looked back through the storm and saw her standing just inside the vestibule, refusing to let him disappear. He made his way back. Frost covered his beard and eyebrows. Agnes pulled him inside and removed his gloves. "You said the cave was supposed to protect us." Everett breathed heavily. "It did. You almost froze outside." "Because I had to keep it breathing." Agnes stared at him. Then perhaps the cave isn't the thing saving me. Everett looked at her. What do you mean? Someone had to care enough to build it. He had no answer. That evening, the storm became worse.
At this point, the story becomes more than a battle against winter. Everett had spent weeks preparing the cave, testing every weakness, moving the firewood, raising the sleeping platform, improving the entrance, and fixing problems before they became disasters. But preparation alone was never the whole story. The cave could hold the warmth, but Everett still had to step into the storm to keep it working. And that is one of the most powerful things about survival. Sometimes, preparation reduces danger, but it does not remove responsibility. Agnes had once believed she was simply waiting for winter to take everything from her. But now, inside this cave, she was beginning to understand something different. She was not just being protected, she was surviving. And Everett was learning something too. He had started building this shelter because he understood the mountain. But somewhere along the way, the reason he kept fighting had changed. It was no longer just about proving that the cave could survive the storm. It was about making sure Agnes did.
The temperature outside dropped below zero. Inside, the cave held at 44 even after the fire burned low. Agnes slept beneath her mother's blanket, while Everett sat beside the stove. For the first time, he realized something had changed. He had started preparing the cave because he feared winter. Now he was staying awake because he feared losing her. At dawn, the storm still raged, but Agnes was breathing steadily, the firewood was dry, and the cave remained warm. Everett opened the ledger and wrote one sentence. Outside, -19. Inside, 43. Agnes safe. He closed the book. Then he heard something beneath the wind. Hoofbeats. Someone was approaching the cave, in weather no sensible person would willingly enter. The hoofbeats stopped outside the cave. Everett reached for his rifle and motioned for Agnes to remain behind him. Through the narrow opening, a figure appeared in the snow, leading a horse that could barely stand. It was Silas Boone, a rancher from the lower valley. His coat was white with frost, and one hand was wrapped around a wounded forearm. "Everett," he called. "Please." Everett opened the outer curtain just enough to pull him inside. Silas collapsed against the wall. Agnes brought a blanket while Everett examined the wound. "What happened?" "My cabin roof collapsed," Silas managed. "My wife and children made it to the neighbor's place, but I got separated from them." Everett looked toward the entrance. "Can they reach you?" "Not in this storm." Silas looked around the cave. "How are you still alive in here?" Everett glanced toward Agnes. Preparation. Silas stared at the wool curtains, the raised platform, the dry firewood, and the stove. "I thought everyone said you were crazy." Everett gave a tired smile. "They did." Silas lowered his eyes. "I was one of them." The admission carried more weight than Everett expected. He gave Silas warm water and helped him settle near the stove. For the next 2 days, the storm refused to break. The cave became a refuge for all three of them. Agnes cooked what little food they had. Everett rationed the firewood. Silas rested while his wound healed enough for him to travel. Every few hours, Everett checked the temperature and the chimney. The lowest reading outside reached 28 degrees below zero. Inside, the cave never dropped below 41. On the third morning, the wind finally weakened. Silas prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, he turned toward Everett. "You didn't just build a shelter." Everett looked at him. "What did I build?" "A place people can survive." Silas looked toward Agnes. "You saved her." Agnes shook her head. "He gave me a place to save myself." Everett looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the praise. When the trail finally opened several days later, Silas returned with his family and brought more supplies than Everett had asked for. Other ranchers followed. They wanted to see the cave. Some came expecting to laugh. None did. They stepped through the wool-lined entrance and felt the difference immediately. They saw the raised sleeping platform, the dry firewood, the covered water basin, and the stove positioned where it could warm the stone without trapping moisture. More importantly, they saw Agnes sitting beside the fire, healthy and steady. The woman everyone had assumed would not survive the winter had become the strongest proof that Everett's strange preparation had worked. By spring, The story had traveled through Blackwater Creek. Ranchers began raising their firewood off the ground. Families added wool barriers to exposed walls. Others built small vestibules over their doors. Everett never claimed he had invented anything. He simply kept refining the cave. One warm morning, Agnes stood outside with her coat open, letting sunlight reach her face. Everett joined her. "You going back to town?" he asked. She smiled. "No." He looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm waiting for my life to end." Everett was quiet. Agnes looked toward the cave. "You gave me more than shelter." "What did I give you?" She smiled. "A reason to believe tomorrow is still mine." Everett looked at the mountain, then at the woman beside him. The cave had begun as a response to winter. Wool had blocked the wind. Firewood had carried warmth through the coldest nights. Stone had held the temperature steady. But none of those things explained why Agnes had survived. The real difference was that someone had seen an older woman standing alone in the cold and decided she was still worth protecting. And sometimes, a second chance doesn't arrive as a grand promise. Sometimes it arrives as a dark cave on a mountain, a stack of dry firewood, a blanket made from wool, and one person who refuses to let winter have the final word.
The winter eventually passed. But the lesson Everett and Agnes carried beyond that mountain was larger than the storm itself. Everett did not save Agnes because he was stronger than everyone else. He saved her because he paid attention. He noticed the signs of winter before other people did. He identified weaknesses before they became disasters. And when something failed, he did not treat failure as the end. He treated it as information. Each problem taught him what to improve. The frozen curtain, the damp firewood, the weak chimney draft, the snow entering through the gaps. None of those problems meant the shelter had failed. They meant the shelter still had something to teach him. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons in this story. Educational lessons. Preparation matters more than confidence. Everett never assumed the cave would work simply because he believed in it. He tested it repeatedly and looked for weaknesses. Small improvements can create major results. Raising the firewood, improving drainage, insulating exposed areas, and monitoring the chimney were simple actions, but together, they made survival possible. Mistakes are information. When something went wrong, Everett did not waste time blaming himself or pretending the problem did not exist. He found the weakness and corrected it. Knowledge becomes more valuable when shared. By spring, other families and ranchers had learned from what Everett had done. One person's careful preparation became useful to an entire community. Entertainment and life lessons. But the emotional lesson may be even more important. Agnes did not need someone to convince her that she was weak. The world had already spent enough time doing that. What she needed was someone who looked at her and decided that her life was still worth protecting. And Everett did something many people forget to do. He saw value where others might have seen a burden. Agnes, in return, reminded Everett that protecting someone does not mean taking away their independence. She was not simply surviving because Everett built a shelter. She survived because, inside that shelter, she was given the space and dignity to keep living. And that is why this story stays with us. Sometimes, the greatest act of kindness is not a grand speech. It is preparation. It is noticing. It is carrying one more bundle of firewood, fixing one more weakness, leaving the door open for someone who believes they have nowhere else to go. Because sometimes, when the world becomes cold, a second chance does not arrive with a miracle. Sometimes, it arrives because one person decides that another human being is worth preparing for. And as Everett watched Agnes standing in the spring sunlight, no longer waiting for her life to end, he understood something the mountain had been trying to teach him all winter. You cannot always stop the storm from coming, but you can decide what you will build before it arrives.